Quickly. Good evening, everybody. We are today going to listen to a master on pediatric palliative care who has been very actively involved with pediatric palliative care for more than 30 years. And she has a nursing and social science background. She was CEO of International Children's Palliative Care Network. But after her retirement in 2017, she established PALCHASE, that is Palliative Care in Humanitarian Aid Situation and Emergencies, which is now part of the Global Health Academy of University of Edinburgh. She's also a global ambassador to International Children's Palliative Care Network. And she has a lot of publications. Then she has worked in various committees in WHO, global advocacy initiatives, and she likes teaching and research. And her special interest is in spirituality in children with palliative care needs. From this, we can understand that Joan Marston is a very apt person to talk about this children's palliative care. So welcome, Joan, and it's over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the welcome and the invitation. I'm just going to share my screen. Here we are. Here we go. Can everyone hear me, I hope? And it's so good to be with you. I've spent many very wonderful times in India, helping to manage a program for 5 years in Maharashtra and visiting various parts of the country. And Dr. Rajgopal is a great friend of mine. So it's really a great delight to be here with you today and to talk about my favorite subject, which is palliative care for children. And so I'd first like to know, are there any of you who work in children's palliative care? Do some of you? No? You're missing out. So where we're going to go today is we're going to look at some of the building blocks. Palliative care for children is a huge subject. It's a subject that I nursed my first child in hospice in 1991. So that's 32 years ago. And if I think what I knew at that stage, and I mean, that was a tiny, tiny, tiny little bit, and how much things have grown and changed and how much learning there has been over so many years, is that it would be impossible to cover everything. So I'm just going to touch on certain things just to tell you about what the status is of palliative care for children and how it developed, because whether you like history or not, where we are today is because of history. It's the foundation of everything that we are. And when we're going to look a little bit at the history of palliative care for children, you'll see that all the programs that we're doing now were being done 30 years ago. And what we're really doing is adding to them, making them larger, making them more complex, but the basics have been there for a long time. We're going to look at what resources there are, and we know that resources vary so tremendously from country to country. And then the issues around palliative care for children as a field. Where does it fit in? What are the elements that make it different? Then I'd just like to highlight a few key developments in more recent times to give you a more local and global picture. But most of all, we're going to look at what does it mean to have a child needing palliative care? And what is it about the child that makes palliative care for children different to palliative care for adults? Although the absolute basics, the principles remain absolutely the same. And so what should we call it? Should we call it children's palliative care? And the ICPCN is the International Network for Children's Palliative Care. Is it pediatric palliative care? And we find the medical and the scientific fraternity like to use that term. Or is it palliative care for children, which more aptly describes actually what it is? And it's what WHO called it when they did the first WHO definition. But actually, it doesn't really matter. They all mean the same thing. And as Shakespeare said, what's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. So call it whatever you feel comfortable with. And if you can come up with a better name, well, won't that be great? And because it's about children, I think we need to look first of all at what is a child and what does a child need? And Tom Stoppard, who wrote some wonderful plays, he said, a child's purpose is not to grow up. And we're so often so worried about how they're developing, how they're doing at school, how they're progressing, we forget the whole purpose of childhood is to be a child. And when we work in the field of palliative care, we must keep absolutely fixed first and foremost that this is a child with the same needs as any other child. What they have over and above that is a condition that we need to deal with, we need to help them deal with, we need to involve them, but it's a condition that is over and above the fact that they are a child. And it's a relatively new field. You know, palliative care is not a very old field. And I know Stephen has given you an amazing overview of palliative care. And children's palliative care developed after the first early developments of the general palliative care field. And so it really began in the 70s and 80s with some fantastic pioneers. And of course, it wasn't called palliative care for children then, but they started the education, the research, the models, the idea of that we're an international, a global community, and we need to collaborate and communicate and learn from each other. They started with the literature that we still use today, and they became powerful voices for the development of the field that we call, well, whatever we call it. I like to call it now palliative care for children. I think it explains it better. And it initially began in the US and the UK, but it wasn't that much later that Europe, India started some wonderful programs. In Asia, Eastern Europe was the first part of Europe to begin with palliative care. And then it spread, well, unfortunately not worldwide. We are still battling to get it worldwide. And it was only after all these things had started that the WHO definition came along. And the WHO, from the time they started developing definitions for palliative care, recognized that children were different and they needed their own definition. So if you want to have a look a little bit more about the history and development, we're going to talk a bit now. There is a brief global history that I wrote on the ICPCN website. And if you have an Oxford textbook of palliative care for children, then there's something in that as well. But of course, all of this is developing within a much bigger environment and involving a lot of other factors that have all influenced the development of the field. And so the whole movement of recognizing the rights of the child, we talk about it quite openly now and we believe it and we protect the rights of the child, but it's a fairly recent occurrence. Of course, it's in how does society view a child? What is the value of the child within that society and in that culture? It's affected by external things like wars. If we look at the war in Ukraine, which has a network of children's palliative care programs, how that's been impacted. It's involved in the development of the field of pediatrics. Again, a relatively new field in medicine. And of course, it's impacted by the parents, the children themselves, those pioneers, those visionaries who started the beginnings of all of these different movements, and the diseases and the disasters. So HIV and AIDS had a huge impact on the development of palliative care. A lot of funding came into places like Africa and India, where our numbers were high, from PEPFAR, from the different agencies from different countries. And this helped with the development. So while these diseases and pandemics were terrible, they actually were also very, very important milestones in developing palliative care for children and brought donors into the field. And this is just how children's rights developed. So the first declaration on the rights of the child was 1924. So that's not even 100 years ago. 1948, there was a Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which said that children are entitled to special care and consideration. And then only in 1989 was there the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child that all our countries have actually signed to, even though we don't implement it always so well. And then, of course, if we're talking about palliative care for a child, we need to look at what is a child. Now, I often ask this question when I do face-to-face teaching. And some people say to me, oh, it's somebody under 10. Others say, oh, it's a little being who's growing and developing. Others say, well, it depends on so many factors, what the resources are. And I saw that very powerfully when I was teaching in a rural area in Tanzania. And I was, of course, teaching on what I see as a child from birth to 18 or even 21 and maybe a bit older sometimes. And my Swahili interpreter kept on looking at me and looking at the people who were asking questions in Swahili. And at the first break, I said to him, what's the problem? And he said, you know, here we've got so few resources for children that when they turn 4 years old, they go into an adult program. And so for that area to provide palliative care for children, they really meant to childhood from birth to 3 years old. And so these kind of things do impact humanitarian crises. You know, because they're children, they are seen as extra vulnerable. But in some cultures, what we would consider a child is actually sent to fight in a war. But what is important is that they are a whole person. So just as you have learned all the principles and know the principles of palliative care, and part of it is holistic care, the care of the body, mind, and spirit, when that tiny little baby is born, they need that care as well. They need care, of course, of the body. That's the primary one. But there's a little mind developing, and there's a spiritual need for connection. And so it's a huge range that we're working with. We're working sometimes from pre-birth, when a diagnosis is made before the birth, into that little toddler, to the school-going child, to that pre-adolescent and the adolescent, to young adulthood. And so the knowledge and the skills that we have to have when we work in this field, from the issues around medication and disease, and of course, with these children, we see a lot of diseases they don't see in adult palliative care, for the simple reason these children don't live to adulthood. But we also have to learn how to communicate, because the way you're going to communicate with a 3-year-old is going to be very different to the way you communicate with a 10-year-old or an 18-year-old. And so it really pushes us to keep up to date and to keep learning and to keep developing new knowledge and skill. And of course, one of the important skills that we have to learn when we're working in this field, well, we don't have to learn, we have to relearn it, because whether we remember it or not, we were all children once, and we all knew how to play. And of course, play is the language that children use so often to communicate and to learn and to express how they're feeling about themselves and about their condition. And so I'm going to just tell the story a little bit about the development. From ancient understanding of children and health, to children being seen as different and developing pediatrics, to the field of palliative care, And then, of course, like any field starts off as a generalist field. And so palliative care was a generalist field, but it really was, Dame Cicely Saunders saw it as from 18 upwards. And there'll be a bit more about her later on when it came to children's palliative care. And when a field is starting to get established, it will then start going off into its different branches. And so just as palliative care has developed some different branches, palliative care for children has as well. But first of all, we had to establish the field. And so we go from generalist to more specialist. And so what about that ancient understanding that children are different? And in fact, 1,550 years ago, before the Common Era, or before Christ, depending on how you say it, the Ebers Papyrus in Egypt identified that children needed different doses of medication and different treatments. And Hippocrates, he was another who recognized that children were different. So we need to know that children have been seen as different and their health needs have been seen as different for a very long time. And I love this poem because I think when we are learning about any field, we have to know where we came from. And this is a Chinese proverb that I used when I started writing the history, is when you drink the waters, and we're drinking the waters now of the presence of palliative care for children, remember the spring, because the spring is there. We might see the river now, we might see all the different streams going off it, but the spring, the source is still there, because we build on foundations we did not lay. We warm ourselves by fires we did not light. We sit in the shade of trees we did not plant. We drink from wells we did not dig. We profit from persons we did not know. And this is as it should be. And we are ever bound in community with them, and may it always be so. So even before the field of children's palliative care started, before we have dates of when programs started, these two towering figures in the development of palliative care had very different views. Now, Cicely Saunders in the UK, she didn't feel there was a need for palliative care for children. She actually never felt there was much need for a hospice beyond St. Christopher's in the beginning. And when the pioneers of palliative care for children in England went to her for support, she said, don't do it. Don't do it. Not enough children, not needed, don't have the resources, pediatrics will look after them. On the other side of the pond in the US, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who of course was working at the same time as Cicely, and who they eventually became good friends. She was incredibly supportive. And if you look at the board's composition of the early organizations, she was on all those boards. She was a great champion of children's hospice and palliative care. And I think that's why palliative care for children actually developed quicker in the US than it did in the UK, because in the UK you had a break on it. Whereas across, as I say, in the US, you had somebody and who was already a towering figure and recognized for her work, supporting it. And so if you look back to 1971, not that long ago, is it, 50 years ago, Ida Marston, who I'm proud to say was a nurse, who worked at the University of Minnesota, had cared for her father-in-law who was dying at home. And when she was asked for advice on a dying child, she thought, well, if we did it for adults, why can't we do it for children? And because she was a magnificent researcher and educator, what she did, she actually researched. And you can still find copies of her home care of dying children. And she didn't only work in the US, she also worked in Asia. And so she took this research over there as well. So, but you have to dig to find it. And it's such a shame because it was so groundbreaking. And then Myra Bluebon Langner, and she's another huge figure. She is an anthropologist and a researcher. And when she was doing her original research, it was about the private worlds of dying children. And something that we recognize today, that children and parents try and protect each other, don't they? The child won't talk about dying or how they feel because they don't want to hurt mommy and daddy. And mommy and daddy don't want to talk about it because they don't want to frighten their child. So this idea of mutual protection. And she later became the first chair of children's palliative care in the UK, winning the post above leading pediatric palliative care clinicians. So that was quite something, a magnificent lady. And the first home care for children came about through a partnership between parents who had a little boy called Edmund and the priest in a Presbyterian church and the community of the Presbyterian church. And this minister happened to have leukemia. And so they started the first home care. And if we look at the work of palliative care for children now, it has research, it has education, it has listening to the families and the children, it has home-based care as well. And these all came out in the 1970s. We've just added to them, and Edmark is still going strong. And then this idea that palliative care for children, or hospice care for children, of course, as it was then called, could be global. And if we're going to be global, we've actually got to get people together. And also this wonderful idea in the beginning that their goal was so to ingrain the hospice concept into pediatrics that it wouldn't be seen as a speciality. It would just be an integral part of healthcare for children and adolescents. And Anne Armstrong Daly, who started it and was a great friend of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she said, parents should never have to choose between hospice care and hope for a cure. And this comes out in the way we behave as well. We say if a child is getting antiretrovirals, if they're getting chemotherapy or radiotherapy, if they're getting surgery to try to cure the disease, they can still have palliative care. Again, going back many years. And she started this idea of international conferences. She'd have one year in the US somewhere and somewhere else the following year. And she actually put on 24 international conferences. And yet I bet most of you haven't heard of her. And then, of course, on the other side, that great teacher, as she was learning from a little girl, she was a pediatric nurse as well as a nun. She said this, and I want you to remember that we're the professionals, we're actually the pupils. The child and the family are the teachers, and every child is a master class. And so we don't learn as much from books and webinars and teaching sessions as we learn from the child and the family. And the more you work with the child and the family, who are your teachers, the more you're going to learn. And she went on to found the first hospice unit, which was Helen House in Oxford, and later one for adolescents, Douglas House. And she also set up the first national network, got people together, produced some excellent textbooks together with parents. So it wasn't just the voice of the professional, it was the voice of the professional and the parent and the child, which is what palliative care for children is today. But it wasn't just there. If we look 85, very special kids started in Australia and children's hospices across Scotland. And this is where the parents came in. And something that we are so bad at so often is that we want to talk. We're the professionals. We need to talk. But actually, the role of the parents in setting up so many programs across the world has been crucial to the development of palliative care for children. And so in the 1980s, we had programs starting now in hospitals. So you can see, again, building on the research to start with, the education, the home care. Now we have the hospitals. So starting at the Bambino Gesù Children's Hospital in Rome, which has a children's palliative care unit, they started a home care pilot. St. Mary's Hospital in New York, and of course, the very well-known Great Ormond Street with Dr. Anne Goldman. And Cicely Saunders also said to her, don't do it. Don't set up a pediatric palliative care team. And then, of course, WHO came along, and after all the groundwork had been done, it was wonderful that they saw from this that we needed a definition for children. And this is the main definition that we use. And I know you'll have gone through the definitions, so I'm not going to go through all the detail. But once again, it's an active and total care of the child. So looking at the child's body, mind, and spirit, and involves giving support to the family. And remember, spiritual care of children is forgotten so often. And it begins when the illness is diagnosed. That's what we say now. But it continues regardless of whether or not a child receives treatment directed at the disease. Again, going back to Anne Armstrong Daly, no parent should have to choose between curative treatment and care that is palliative. And so we've got to do this holistic care of every child. And it's going to be different. The way you assess a child's emotions, a child's spiritual connections, a child's pain is so often different because of the way they communicate, different ways of communicating, and we have got to learn different skills. And of course, as we know with palliative care, it can be given wherever that person is, whether it's that newborn baby, the little child, or the adult. But I think this is probably a better definition because it comes from a little boy who lived to 13 years with a condition where he needed palliative care almost from birth. He was the fourth child in his family to have the same condition. All of the children died, and when he was alive, his mother developed, or she actually was obviously the carrier, and she started showing symptoms of the adult form of a rare form of muscular dystrophy. And he was a writer, he was a poet, he was a philosopher. And he said, palliative care for children no longer means helping children to die well. It means helping children to live well, and then when the time is certain, to help them die gently. And I actually would like that as a philosophy of life. Isn't that something, to live well? And then when the time comes, to die gently. And he published 3 books of poetry before he died at 13. So he showed us what could be done. And he was in a wheelchair, he had parenteral feeding, he had help with respiration, as you can see, but he had a shining light within. And so we see from those beginnings that are still there. Across India, across Africa, we see home-based care programs. We see programs in hospitals. We see programs that are run from clinics. We see units outside of hospitals. We see units within hospitals. And so as the field of palliative care for children began to find its feet and to get established, and believe me, it wasn't easy in those early days because the adult palliative care people didn't really want to listen to us. We were the children's group. You know, we were making a lot of noise, but they did treat us a bit like children. But it's now growing and developing, and that is a sign of an established field. And these are just some of the areas, but perhaps the areas that at the moment are more developed. And I would say neonatal palliative care is the area that is most active, that is really growing and developing beautifully across the world, that has a wealth of literature and research behind it, but also for adolescents. And of course, when we're working with adolescents, we're dealing very much with spirituality, questions about meaning and connection, but we're also dealing with sexuality. And that is a field that if people are scared to talk about spirituality, if you talk about sexuality, they sort of go, yes, and move on. But don't forget it. It's a very important field in palliative care for children. Children with disabilities, children with cancer, children with organ-specific diseases. And as we're seeing more and more humanitarian disasters and crises and uncertainty in the world, the need for psychosocial and spiritual care is now developing. And a lot of it is being stimulated by humanitarian disasters. So I'd like you to think for a little while, under which discipline should palliative care for children fall? We've talked about pediatrics. We've talked about palliative care. We started here under community health in South Africa. Palliative care for children started under community health because it started under the general palliative care discipline. But then we've moved out and we've put ourselves under pediatrics. So think about where you think it should. Should it be in pediatrics? Should it be in palliative care? Should it be in primary health care? Because if we want to get palliative care to everyone as part of universal health coverage, we need to have it in primary health care. Should it be in community health? Should it be in all of these or none of these? Or is there another? So if you think of another one, I'd love that you've just put it in the chat. Sorry, something has stopped. Let me just, oh dear, it's not moving forward. There we go. And then as the field grew and developed, we decided to set up a global network because we realized if we stayed under the very, very thoughtful and considerate and helpful other global organizations, especially the Worldwide Hospice Palliative Care Alliance, if we were forever just a little special interest group, we would never grow and develop the way we felt the children had the right to have their own global organization. I mean, they're nearly half the population of the world. In parts of the world, they're over 50% of the population. So we felt they should actually have their own place and their own global organization. So in March 2005, when we were meeting in Seoul, in South Korea, 15 countries were represented, and we set up the founding statement on hospice and palliative care for children. And these are true today. They're just as true today as they were in 2005. The children and adolescents with life-limiting conditions have very specific palliative care needs, which are often different to those of adults. If these children and adolescents' physical, emotional, social, spiritual, and developmental needs are to be met, the carers, and that includes us, require special knowledge and skill. But I think this is the important part. We ask that the voice of these children and adolescents is heard, respected, and acknowledged as part of the expression of hospice and palliative care worldwide. And it's something we still do very, very badly. So while we have developed quite far, there's still many, many miles to go. And Francina just reminds us that children speak to us with many different languages and in many different ways. And we've spoken about play, but art is another one. And Francina was 10. She'd been in hospice care for 5 years, and she knew that her life was drawing to a close. She had renal failure. She didn't qualify for either a transplant or dialysis. And this wasn't long before she died. So she had her life as bright colors, but she had some dark clouds there between her and the sun. So we need to look at the way the children express themselves, and to allow them to draw is a really important part of what we do. And so if we're going to look at the global picture from an organizational point of view, at the international level, we have the International Children's Palliative Care Network. And that could be your greatest resource, is their website, because they have a very good website and a new one coming out with a lot of resources. And they also have excellent online free e-learning courses. And the first one in Hindi, in fact, has just come out. Then you have your regional special interest groups under the regional organizations. So you have the European Association of Palliative Care, the Asia Pacific Hospice Network, and the Latin American Network. In Africa, we had one, and it's just sort of gone very quiet. So we have to get that up and going again. And then there's the Sunflower Children's Network. that has been started in Asia. We have national associations, not enough yet. There are very few across the world. And just examples of Together for Short Lives, which again in itself is an excellent resource, especially for documents. And Patch South Africa is a strong one. And then within national organizations and associations, we have special interest groups. So your national organization in India, we had a special interest group, there is one there for pediatrics. And then of course, the organizations that do the work on the ground, that are actually your shining examples of what we can do for children, and so often get forgotten because they haven't got the big voice of ICPC or EAPC or the Indian Association of Palliative Care. It's a little voice, but actually, if we look at what they're doing and how they're doing it, that should be the biggest voice. And then more and more other global organizations are integrating palliative care. And World Childhood Cancer International, the NCD Alliance, all of these are, and even some of the humanitarian groups now are bringing it into their work. And this is just a production, but children's rights, even before we had the ICPC and Elizabeth Quesada Tristan had drawn up one in Costa Rica. And there's a number of different ones that have been developed saying, this is the right of every child who has palliative care needs, and it's listed. And we did have it translated into Hindi. I think that's the only Indian language. But anyone who'd like to translate into other languages is very willing and is willing to help would be very welcome. And this is the newest one that's come out. It's a charter on palliative care, but it includes children's rights. And it's on the EAPC website, and it came out through the EAPC Children and Young People's Reference Group. So again, lots of resources out there if this is something you're interested in. And what I often say is if you're working in adult palliative care, you're going to be working with children because you're going to be working with your patient's children and maybe younger siblings. If you're working in children's palliative care, you're going to be working with adults because you're working with the parents and the grandparents and the teachers and all aunts and uncles and the community. So even if you're working in adult palliative care, you need to have skills on children's palliative care. And if you're working in children's palliative care, we need to have those skills from adult palliative care as well. And so this is the latest picture from ICPC, but it's a few years out of date. And like any assessment that we do, it becomes out of date even before you published it. But we did some research and we identified that more than 21 million children would benefit from palliative care. That's a lot of children, isn't it? 98% of them are in low and middle income countries. 51% in Africa. Now, if you look at Africa, it's got a few dark green places, South Africa, Malawi, Uganda, low income countries, but they've got good palliative care. A number of countries that have got something going on, but look at how many countries have no palliative care for children. And yet 51% of the children who need palliative care are in Africa. So we hang our heads in shame, we haven't got it out far enough. But if we look at the map as well, you will see that India, you've got some beautiful programs, you've got some beautiful education across India, but because you're such a huge country and because you have such a huge population, is that it's not available everywhere. But in this era of technology, doesn't matter where you are, well, pretty much where you are in the world, is that if you need advice, if you need help, then it's available through technology. But most of the palliative care resources, most of the funding for palliative care, most of the programs, most of the professionals doing it are in the high income countries. So you've got the US and Canada, got Argentina, which is a low income country, but used to be a higher income country. Costa Rica and Uruguay have come on as well. You've got Australia and New Zealand. And then if we go to Europe, you've got the UK and France and Germany and Italy and Ukraine. Ukraine, before the war, had developed a government-funded network of palliative care and palliative care for children across the country. And because it was developed and because it was funded, and despite everything, their government continues to fund palliative care because they recognize with the increase in deaths and suffering, it's an essential part of care. So where palliative care is established, if a humanitarian disaster happens, then the palliative care will continue in a different way, not as much as it could. The opioids tend to get actually then sent to people with traumatic injuries. You can still continue. But I've recently been in contact with Turkey, and it doesn't help being in contact with Syria because there is no palliative care in Syria. But in Turkey, there is some. But because it is not integrated into the health system, I've been battling to find any palliative care. And yet they've had this huge number of deaths and people suffering loss and grief in that area. So again, it shows us that where you have the resources and where there's political will, you can get palliative care for children developed. And we reckon there's only around 5% of children who need palliative care who are getting it. That's not a great way to go. So while we've come a long way in 50 years, we've still got a very, very, very long way to go. This is a more recent map, and it was done on national expert perceptions. Now, there's always a bit of a challenge with that. I've taken part in a few research practices looking at national expert perceptions. And so it depends on the expert that you interview. And so you'll see South Africa and India actually have gone down compared to the ICPCN map. But I actually think that the ICPCN map is a much more valid representation of what's going on. And as I've mentioned, there are these huge inequalities within countries and between countries. So I think we know in our own countries where you have the cities, where you have the bigger hospitals, where you have the universities and training centers, your chances of a child getting palliative care are going to be a lot greater than if you go into the villages. And so when we were working in Maharashtra, we realized that unless we taught the ASHA workers about identifying these children to refer them, because if they're not identified, we're not going to get it. We're not going to get anywhere. And these disparities can be caused by many things. They can be caused by political will. If you've got government and governance that feels palliative care is important, you're going to get the resources to do it. So many countries have got very fragile health systems, not much money, not great facilities, not great access, and then the lack of resources. And again, human, financial, and remember poverty. Poverty is just probably the most important factor in countries that affect our access. Education and medicines, and of course, discrimination as well. So the value of a child, the value of a woman in a country is really going to impact whether that child gets palliative care. And Dr. Gayatri Palat from Hyderabad, who has run the longest fellowship in India for children's palliative care, in 2021, she wrote in e-hospice that these are just some of the challenges. The large number and wide geographical distribution of children with chronic diseases poses logistical challenges like quality versus coverage and care coordination. Most children and families wish to stay at home instead of in hospital. But what happens with these seriously ill children is they get sent to a hospital, which is often a long way away from home. The broad and heterogeneous conditions requiring pediatric palliative care, this can make it there's so few people who are specialists in pediatric palliative care. that child might not get the treatment that they need. The complexity of patient care with palliative care, it requires a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary intervention. And so often there's no access, direct access. And that's when we have to use technology. We have this wonderful, wonderful, magical access. I don't pretend to understand how it works, but I know it does. And then lack of access to opioid medications causes needless suffering to so many children in pain. Just a few of the challenges in low and middle income countries that we need to fight to overcome. So again, our voices, and the voices of children and families. And then more and more, the children who are affected by humanitarian crises. So and now, in fact, there's 338 million in need of humanitarian aid. 1 in every 30 now worldwide. And 75% are women and children. And what affects women is going to affect children as well. So at least 35 million children. So that's, part of that is going to add to the numbers that we have. And what does it mean for children's palliative care? The need for palliative care increases in a humanitarian crisis, but access and resources decrease. Priorities change, and we need to be able to adapt and to innovate. As I've mentioned, pain medications get relocated for traumatic injuries. And there's a breakdown in access to accessing medications, accessing treatments, getting to hospitals, practitioners getting to children. And there's an increased mortality. And there's a huge, enormous need for mental health support, for trauma and bereavement services. And we don't have the capacity to do it. So all of these are challenges that we have to look to meet in the future. And what we often forget, an increase in the need for neonatal palliative care. Because in any humanitarian crisis, there's about a 50% increase in premature and complicated births. Huge. We've seen it in the war in Ukraine. We've seen it in earthquakes in Turkey and Syria. We've seen it in flooded areas. And then the impact of poverty, where young girls are getting pregnant, where they're not going for maternal health, so they're having complications, the impact of poverty, which increases in humanitarian settings. And so which children would benefit from palliative care? I'm sure you've heard this, and Stephen, I'm sure, said it, is that the way we look at it now is that those experiencing serious health-related suffering, but having been in the field for a long time, I find with so many people, if I say it's children experiencing serious health-related suffering, I still get asked, well, which children are they? Are they children with cancer? Are they children with disabilities and cerebral palsy? And so we have two really good assessments we can do. We can look at the Together for Short Lives categories, which have been used for many years. Life-threatening conditions for which curative treatment may be feasible but can fail. Conditions where premature death is inevitable. Progressive conditions without curative treatment options. And irreversible but non-progressive conditions which makes the child more susceptible to health complications like serious trauma, like cerebral palsy. And so we need to be able to identify these children. And this is another much more recent screening tool that has been developed with fairly recent research by Eva Bergenstrasser, Richard Hain, and Jose Pereira. And I'm going to send you these documents, and they look at 5 domains: estimated life expectancy, expected outcome of current treatment directed at the disease and the burden of treatment, the performance status of the child, or the activities of living, how they play, how they interact, the symptom and the problem burden, and the preference. So important. What are the patient? What does the child want? What does the family? And what does the health professional want as well? Because sometimes the health professional does know better, but we've got to take everyone's preference into account. And these are global. Remember, this is a global statistic. So in India, you have a much bigger percentage of children with cancer. But this is a global statistic in Stephen Connor's Global Atlas. So HIV, we're still seeing a lot of deaths in HIV, again, because of lack of children accessing the treatment. Premature births and birth trauma and congenital anomalies. So you can see that time of birth is such a vulnerable time where we need to focus more of our palliative care resources, injuries and cancer, and where most children live in Africa and in Southeast Asia. But the most resources, again, are in high-income countries. And then WHO, also slightly different figures, but they do them at different times. But what I like is that they've highlighted protein, energy, malnutrition, because we know that that is a complicating factor and increases the risk of mortality. So access to education is increasing. We have university chairs, we have university courses, degrees, masters, do a PhD. We have really a blossoming number of fellowships that you can do in different parts of the world. Lots of online and Zoom teaching. The wonderful EPIC course, which started in the US with Stefan Friedrichsdorf, who's my model for pain management and dealing with sick children, and Joan Wolf. And now it's been taken out to different parts of the world. It's been to India, it's been to Africa. It's going to be, this month, it's in the Philippines. And so they're taking this amazing curriculum, which not only trains us to provide the care, but also trains trainers as well to the different parts of the world. And of course, short courses, webinars, mentorships, congresses, and online training. But there's also a hidden curriculum. We can get so caught up with doing online, with doing Zoom learning, with learning through these different media, that we forget that the most learning, and going back to Sister Francis, the most learning is from our teachers, the child and the family. And when we learn, when we get the knowledge, we also need to get the skills. And so many of these courses have a limited amount of practical time, and we need to increase that. But it also means we need more mentors. So we need more people trained in palliative care for children, so we can have more mentors, so we can have more practical experience for people. And this is another article that I will send to you. Research is increasing. We're getting more tools, but they're coming mostly from high-income countries and academics, where the need is greatest in low and middle-income countries. There are many gaps. There's nothing really done that's worthwhile around economics of children's palliative care. And the methodology around the need varies so much that we have hugely different numbers that are given to us around children needing palliative care. And we know for advocacy, we need to know how many and how much. We have got a lovely, fairly new set of standards that a number of us from across the world in practice, academic, working in different fields, contributed to. And so for standards, I would really recommend that you use the Impact and GoPact standards. That's another document that I will send to you. And we also have a way to measure the outcomes, because we need to know with our children, how is this impacting the palliative care that we give to improve their quality of life, to help them to live well. As you know, as Matty Stepanek said, so we look at the symptoms, how they play, how they socialize, the psychological, the families, the social, how they accept the help and advice that we give. And the authors recognize they left out spiritual. The end of life, this is another lovely piece of research. Again, I'm going to send it to you because I think it's excellent. And I'll also send you the PowerPoint presentation. You're welcome to use it. And this is a beautiful piece of research that the Dr. Po-Heng Chong from Singapore did for his PhD. And it's really worthwhile because even though it was done in a high income country, I'm still working actively in our children's hospice that I started 25 years ago. is that I can use this just as well with the children I'm working with in really, really poor settings. And the under-recognized aspects I've highlighted already, spiritual and sexuality. But there's an increased realization of the value of spirituality and spiritual care. The George Washington Institute for Spirituality and Health has developed this wonderful training course that there often are bursaries to attend. It's both online and face-to-face, and they have a special section for children now. Technology is a priority, and we know children love technology. We love technology too. And it not only helps us to reach each other and to help each other, but it also is something that children love doing. So we can give them an app to show their pain on. We can give them an app to talk about their emotions. We can WhatsApp them when we want to converse with them because they like discussing like that. So we need to use more technology, and UNICEF and other UN agencies have specific departments working on this. And what's lovely to see, and again, this is what the Ukraine war has brought about, is this active collaboration between countries. We've been working as part of a communicative and collaborative group called Safer Ukraine to get children with palliative care needs out of Ukraine, out of the war zones, for care and for treatment into many different countries. You can see how many countries have been involved. And that's involved the people working in the field of palliative care for children working together. So it's really been exciting to be part of that, much as I wish the war would end today. And out of it, we realize that we are a global community. We're not just a little community in a country or a region. We're actually a global community. And what we've said to our colleagues in Ukraine, and this is our declaration, how we will stand with them and we will help them and we will be there as a listening ear. We will be there to check in on them. We will be there to get resources to them. And it ends with, you are not alone. We stand with you. We will not forget you. So as children's palliative care, we are pushing this idea that we are a global community. And then along with those other groups that I spoke about, there's been this really interesting rise of individual organizations in a specific country that have had powerful impact on the development of palliative care for children. The Maruzza Foundation in Rome has been fabulous with education and advocacy at global level. With the research, they developed the standards with their biannual conferences, which are beautiful to attend, and with their strong links with the Vatican. And they have brought together faith leaders from all different types of faiths to develop a charter on palliative care for children. St. Jude, which of course is a very fabulously wealthy children's cancer hospital, has a global outreach now. And again, they fund new initiatives. They help with education, collaboration, with humanitarian help, and Safer Ukraine with research. And then the EPIC Pediatrics, which has really, really taken education out there. That was a collaboration of individuals, starting off in the US, but involving people from many different parts of the world, including India and Africa. Sorry. And so we have lots of challenges. We've got to speak out more. We've got to be stronger advocates, not just an add-on to adult palliative care advocacy. We've got to have a greater involvement of our children and our adults. We have to monitor properly. So we have it on a personal level. We've got the CPOS, but we've got to have realistic country level indicators to show the impact of palliative care for children. We're in policy. Look, wherever we go, national, global, but it's got to have dedicated funding to implement it at national level and funding. So I'm part of a group that is now trying to develop a global business case to get more funders and more governments to put money in. Research, we need lots more research for those who like research. It's a field that's wide open. And so we need more integration, more education, more practitioners, more funding, more recognition that we are a field on its own and we're a developing field, and we're a field that is important for children. So we need recognition and acceptance. And part of what we do to advocate is on the second Friday of October every year, we have something called Hats On for Children's Palliative Care, Hats On for CPC. And we ask people around the world to wear a hat on that day. And when people say, why are you wearing a hat? To say, because I'm supporting children's palliative care. And it's an activity that we started in 2016, and it really is spreading across the world. So that's a fun and easy way to say I support children's palliative care and to get involved. There are lots of resources, and all of these are going to be sent to you. And we have our own journal. That's a fairly new journal. It started last year and came from the Marston Foundation in Rome. They started it, but I'm on the editorial board, and we're representatives from a wide variety of countries, disciplines, different ages. So it's something you can contribute to. It's an online journal. From textbooks to WHO resources that are freely available online. These are available on the ICPCN website. They're freely available, really worth using. And remember, when we talked about in the beginning, it was about allowing the child to be a child. Andrew Lake was the former CEO of UNICEF, and he said, what we have to provide is the quiet miracle of a normal life. So always remember, that child with cancer, that child with SMA, that child with severe cerebral palsy, with HIV, we're dealing with the child first, and we're dealing with all the symptoms and the impact on the child to allow that child the quiet miracle of a normal life. So thank you for listening to me, and I would love to answer if I can. If I don't have the answers, I'll definitely get somebody who does know them. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Joan, and thank you for that 360-degree review of pediatric palliative care. And now the session is open for discussion.
Well, it's nice to see that. I'm looking at what you said here. It should be an all. I agree with you there. Pediatrics. To me, the primary for me, and there's no right or wrong answer. If I were to put it in one discipline, I would put it in pediatrics, because we're dealing with children, and you have to know about the way they develop, the way they think, all of those things before you can actually work with them. But I like that it should be available in all.
Madam, when you're talking about neonatal palliative care, what exactly can we do there? I'm totally lost when you're talking about neonatal palliative care.
Well, if we look at what palliative care is, it's dealing with suffering. And if you look at that little neonate, first of all, you've got the parental suffering. And we know in palliative care, it's never just the patient, it's the patient in the family. And with children, it's very much there. So can even start before the child is born if there's been a diagnosis of some serious condition that either the child may die at birth or very soon after birth, or may be born with some kind of condition that will need palliative care. So we would start with the parents. If the child is if we feel there's a high chance that the child is going to either be stillborn or die soon after birth, then what we do is we arrange that there's someone there at the birth. And that's when you allow the mother and father to spend time with that little one. You take little handprints and footprints. The child has got hair, you can take a little lock of the hair. You take the photographs. You keep very much in the background while you're doing this, because it's about the parents and the child. And then if that child is a child who does live, we do what we do with anyone in palliative care. We look at them as a total person. So how do we relieve the physical suffering? What are the interventions we're going to do there? And a lot of the medications that we use with adults, we can use in minute dosages for these tiny little neonates as well. So what is
Even
the plan?
morphine?
Mhm.
Even morphine, madam?
So even morphine, yes, yes. But again, tiny dosages,
No.
tiny dosages. And a lot depends on what we think the child's life expectancy will be as well. So we might do an advanced care plan before the birth so that everybody has an idea of what they want in place. It can change, we know that. Parents can change their mind. But it gives us an idea of that. Say we have a child with anencephaly. We know that the child can die very soon after birth, but we know they could live a day, 2 days, a little bit longer than that. We're going to make sure that that child is comfortable. That if there are any signs of pain, that we give pain medication. That we give them some kind of feed, not to extend their life. We're not going to extend their life, but to give that child the comfort. We're going to encourage the parent to hold that child, to give that child the emotional comfort. And what is spirituality? Spirituality is about meaning and purpose and connection. So meaning for that parent could be, I spend time with my baby. So we can do all of that. And it might be in a very, very short period of time that we have to do it. Or it could be that child who is actually going to live for quite a long time with that condition that they have. And then we're going to be helping that parent over a much longer period of time as well. But in the neonatal period, we will look at the comfort of the baby, the comfort of the parent. We will look at making sure that that child feels loved, because we know babies feel loved. You know that baby, when they cuddle up, they feel loved. We'll do with that baby what we would give any baby. And if there is a chance the child will live longer, then of course we'll make a plan outside of the neonatal time and to carry on with the child. But emotional support, spiritual support for the family, education, help if the parents go home with the child, an advanced care plan for the baby as well, all the things that are part of what we do, multidisciplinary interventions and ongoing connection. And then of course, when the child dies, that bereavement support that is so important in palliative care.
I know that now even people do perinatal palliative care.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
So in addition to neonatal, it has gone beyond that to perinatal palliative care.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we talk about neonatal palliative care in general as the bigger field, but that you're quite right, that includes perinatal palliative care as well. Some people call it perinatal palliative care, but most of the literature that's coming out calls it neonatal palliative care, but accepting that whole period is covered with that baby and with the parents. And of course, the ethical decision-making that comes about that I didn't even touch on. You know, we've all watched the discussions about children being taken off artificial ventilation, who makes decisions. So that's a field as well, that's lots and lots of landmines in that field.
There are a few questions in the chat. One is about spirituality assessment in pediatrics. Do we use the same FICA or POP scales? And connected with that, how to address after death conversation if adolescents
that's a very big question, because if we, as in the beginning, as I said, we're dealing with that child. So if I'm dealing with spirituality and spiritual care with a 3-year-old, it's going to be very different to what I do with the adolescent, who I will speak to, who can tell me what gives their life meaning and purpose, and how they connect and how they communicate. Whereas the little 3-year-old, I'm going to have to do a lot of observation of that child and then help them with the connection part. So and I mean, that's something I'm passionate about, and I love to give talks on that, is that sometimes we can't easily do a spiritual assessment, but we can do spiritual care, because it's helping that child with their connection connections with others, connections with nature, connections with play, and to feel love, because that gives meaning and purpose. But that's a very big question, and it really needs a lot, but I can give you some literature on that as well.
Another question, now sexuality is becoming open and wide and coming out at teenage level. How we start conversation in front of the family and how we address them. Pedigree chart suitability in this context.
The whole thing with it depends which age group you're working with. So I did quite a bit of work in schools in earlier years. Then I said, no, they need a younger person when I got older. And I would throw all the teachers out of the classroom when I spoke. So I wouldn't say that if you're dealing with an adolescent, is that rather do it when the parents aren't around, because they're going to be sitting there with big eyes and they're going to try and intervene. And remembering that sexuality is more than sex. Sexuality is how you express yourself as your gender, whatever gender that may be. Allowing ourselves. So I identify myself as female. So I like to wear a bit of lipstick. And if I'm dealing with a teenage girl who identifies as female, I'm going to do my best to help her to feel as pretty and as attractive and look like her friends as possible. I'm going to try and find her a nice wig that looks like her normal hair. I'm going to try her and keep her interacting with her friends as long as possible. I'm going to talk to her friends to help her just keep her femininity. So it's more than about sex. But then you have the actual issues around sex and the questions that they want to ask and the things they want to express. And that is truly when I would really ask the parents to step outside, unless the child has a very open relationship with the parent. So you don't just dive into it. You get to know the child so that they feel comfortable. And even though when I was doing a lot of sexuality education, it was with kids who weren't sick, it was children in schools, I was horrified by the questions some 18-year-old boys and girls asked, which showed that really they didn't have much clue around the dangers of sex. So again, it depends on the situation. Every child is different, every adolescent is different. And in the beginning, it can just be help them to just feel good about who they are. And you know, and I mean, I tell you this, I told you about Sister Frances Dominica, who started Helen House and then realized that adolescents actually needed their own space, is that boys, especially the boys with Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, she was seeing a lot of children like that. And these boys were saying that they have the same desires as any other teenage boy, and they want to experience sex before they die. And she actually was, she was on television for this, a nun. She got prostitutes that were specially trained to work with the disabled. Because remember, just because your body doesn't look the same as other teenagers, it doesn't mean that anything changes with your hormones and with you inside. And so if we say we're dealing with the whole person, we're going to have to deal with that as well. And of course, she did it with permission from the parents, who also, when she spoke to them, were sensitive to their child's needs. I don't know if I go that far, but I admire Sister Frances for doing it. And they say she was on BBC television about it. But sexuality is much more than that. It's about having relationships, just ordinary friendships with people of another gender. It's about being able to mix in a group and still maintain who you identify yourself as. And they say it's actually almost easier with girls because, yes, you can put on a bit of makeup if they identify as female. You can put a pretty wig on. You can get nice clothes for them. But it's important for them to feel that they are, even though they might have cancer, They're actually inside. They're just a normal teenager, a normal adolescent.
So there are a few more questions. One is about when a non-pediatric palliative care physician can handle pediatric palliative care, and what is the need of the hour in India? Is it generalized pediatric palliative care, or should it be specialty or subspecialty, super specialty? So those are a few questions.
Yeah. In a perfect world, we would have enough people trained in children's palliative care, pediatric palliative care, to be able to do it, but of course we can't. And in many instances, it is an adult palliative care physician, but if they're humble enough to recognize there's some things they don't know. Remember, the principles are the same. The principles are the same, but it's how you adapt it. And so often when we get asked about a child in a country where we know there's no pediatric palliative care physician, we'll get an adult palliative care physician to work with a pediatrician. And so in this day of an age of technology, we can actually link them up to someone who's a specialist in pediatric palliative care. So definitely the way things are now, and the way things will be into any foreseeable future, is that adult palliative care clinicians should have some knowledge of pediatric palliative care. And we should be able to link people to get the knowledge that they don't have. But some of the skills are communication skills with children, you know, what to say, what not to say, how do you deal with the parents? Because we know it's extra fragile people that we're dealing with in this situation. And then about the general, of course, we think everyone should be a generalist in children's palliative care, just to say it should be a generalist in palliative care. So when we're teaching communication skills, we should be teaching communication skills with adults, but we should also be teaching communication skills with children as well. When we're talking about use of opiates, we should also have, and we have formularies for children's palliative care that are excellent that you can use. So we have the resources. And I think when I started this 32 years ago, we were cobbling it together from the little bit we knew and the little bit we could find out and what the children were telling us. So there are always resources that you can use, but we need the specialists. And we need them across all of the disciplines. So we need the specialist clinicians, absolutely. But we need the nurses to also be special. We need nurses who are specialists as well. And it might be they're specialists with a different set of skills. We need psychologists with the skills. We need social workers, definitely, with children's palliative care skills. So, but it's like that triangle where we want everyone to have the basic skills, going up to the few who will be specialists, and there should be specialization, I believe, in palliative care, especially because we're dealing with such a wide age group, such a wide area of development, such a number of conditions. And we definitely see more conditions in children's palliative care than you see in adult palliative care, simply because some children don't make it to adulthood. And when you do get that rare child who does, you find the adult clinicians are often in panic because they've never dealt with that condition before. So there needs to be a lot of interlinking as well. I don't know, does that answer? So we need to be advocating for the specialists as well as the generalists.
Yeah, thank you. That answered my question, Joan. Thank you so much.
Another question which usually I hear, which Dr. Amrita has pointed out, when there is a death of a pediatric patient happens in the ward, palliative care ward, the team is very stressed, emotionally involved, and how can we help the team to come up from that stress, and how they can is there any mechanism by which and we should allow them to cope with the situation?
I think we need to go from in the beginning. Some people are never going to be able to cope with it, and they shouldn't be working with children because there are some people who really cannot deal with it. The basic is have people properly trained and mentored by people who know what they're doing, mentored by people that they can be alongside so that they develop their competence and their confidence as well. Because if you feel that you have the knowledge, so you understand how this condition is going to progress, and if you feel you have the competence to deal with what is happening to the child, or at least to help the child and the family deal with it, it's going to help you to cope better. But you also need that team cohesion. You need to have those times of support. I work with a children's hospice that I started 25 years ago. I have staff there that started with me 25 years ago. And we get very emotionally involved with our children because a number of our children are with us for many years before they die. So we spend a lot of time in having group meetings, in having discussions. We have a chaplain. It doesn't matter who your chaplain is, someone who can deal with spiritual issues. Because when a child dies, a lot of it is about, this is unfair, this child shouldn't die, they're so young, they shouldn't suffer. We ask these questions, don't we? And it makes us suffer as well. So we find that whether you call it a spiritual worker with your team, or we call it a chaplain because I do work in a part of our country which is very predominantly Christian in outlook. But we also deal with the traditional healers, the sangomas, who know about the spiritual beliefs of the cultures that we work in as well. So very important to work with those. And to be able to identify when someone is not coping, to have backups, to have people that you can refer individuals to. But you don't stay in this field unless you learn how to, you grieve and you keep that child in your heart. If I could see a picture of all the children that I've ever cared for, it runs into thousands and thousands, because I worked through the AIDS pandemic when we lost thousands of children, is that it's hard and you've got to allow yourself to show emotion. You've got to allow yourself to cry. You need to support each other. You need to form a team and to play together. And that can be one of the fun things, is if you do play activities together. It's part of your learning to working with the children and communicate. But when you play, you relax with each other, don't you? And it might be someone you don't like very much, but suddenly you're teamed up and you find, hey, they're really quite skillful at this painting and coloring. And we see different sides of them. So it requires work. We don't just throw people into children's palliative care without preparation and without making sure that there is some kind of support program that is there. Communication, talk, get them to talk. They can't cope, get them to feel safe enough to come and say, I can't deal with this anymore. I need a break. Because it is hard. It really is. There are days when I think, why am I doing this? But at the end of the day, we know that life has a beginning and an end, don't we? And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she wrote a beautiful letter called the Dougie letter, because a little boy wrote to her who had cancer. And she said to him, she'd met him in an airport. He was 9 years old. His name was Dougie. And she said, if you've got any questions, just write to me. And he wrote to her and said, why do little children have to die? And she wrote to him about nature, that some plants grow like a tree and they live for a long time and they have lots of things they have to carry out, about bearing fruit and photosynthesis so that they can help us to breathe. And others flower just for a little time, but they come on earth with a purpose. And here we come into the spiritual element, that every life has a purpose and has meaning. and we come into life to finish what is our purpose in life. And then we go back to where we came from. So also it involves a spiritual life as well. So I think it's important to nurture your spirituality, whatever your belief is in life and death and what happens after death. So whether it's reincarnation, whether it's a life after death, the way she explained it using nature was some plants flower for one day and then they die. But they've shown their beauty for that one day, they've completed what they needed to do, and then they die. So we've got to come to terms with that as well. That we're lucky. We've lived to the age that we've lived. But some children aren't. I have a belief in a life after death. And so if a child asks me what's it like to be dead, I'll ask them what they think it is. And then if they say to me, what do you think, Sister Joan, they call me Sister Joan, I'll say to them, well, I believe it's a beautiful place and we're all going to be well and we're going to be happy and we're going to see the people that we love. But that's what I believe. You don't have to believe the same thing. But children also are very accepting. But it's how we deal with loss and grief. And remember, you will grieve, and it's normal.
Pairu, would you like to ask your question?
Hello, ma'am. Thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. What I was trying to ask is dealing with the death or the process of the palliative care, especially the children and their agonizing parents, is very tough. I want to ask how you have managed yourself for so many years, seeing those death and the suffering, especially the pediatric cases, and how can we cope up? Because it's kind of heart-wrenching to see the child suffering.
Well, I think the last bit that you said is that's what we're there for, is to help the child not to suffer. And that's where our skills in children's palliative care have got to come into play. And children's suffering is actually a lot easier to deal with than the suffering of the adolescent and the suffering of the parents and the grandparents and the siblings that we have to deal with as well. Because children are quite easily distracted, even when they've got a lot of pain and you start blowing bubbles. I was in the hospice the other day and I always carry bubbles with me. And there was a little one and they'd given the child pain medication, but of course it takes a little bit of time. It was a new admission and I took out the bubbles and within seconds, this child who'd been crying with pain suddenly started to smile and started trying to catch the bubbles. So we can use a lot of distraction. So we can always do something. Sorry. How I deal with it, I work on my spiritual life a lot. I honestly have a very strong belief that we come from the world of the spiritual world, whether you call it heaven, whether you call it God, whatever your view is, whatever you call it. And that life is a circle. We come and we do what we're meant to do, and then we leave, but we don't leave into a void and into punishment or into nothing, that we lead into a better place. So that's my honest belief. So if a child asks me or a parent asks me, I can say, this is my belief. But your belief is your belief. As I say, it could be reincarnation, and that's a beautiful belief as well. That life continues, but it's still life continuing, isn't it? The people who suffer the most are those who have no belief. We say, no, this life is the end. And when my child dies, that was it. That was it. He had his 6 months. And that was, and that's hard to find meaning in that. So for myself, it's been a process. It's still not always easy. But I've also learned the value of community, the value of having people that you can talk to. I've been lucky in the value of a husband who just says, all right, what do you need? A glass of wine or a shoulder to cry on? It's having friends or family or just someone who cares enough about you to to sit you down and say, tell me about it. Or for me to say, I just want to talk about it, I just want to cry. Or just leave me alone, I need to deal with it on my own. I need to be angry with God. I need to say to God, I'm really cross with you. What are you doing? Why did you do this? But the suffering part is what palliative care is there to do. And that's why we need to do whole person care. And with a child, body, mind, and spirit. But as I say, children, I find younger children are easier to deal with because they haven't got to the stage where they think, I'm being punished, I've done something really bad. When they get to the stage of magical thinking, I've done something wrong, or the parents with their guilt feelings. And parents, I just find you've just got to keep being there for them, letting them talk about their child. I've got parents whose children I nursed over 30 years ago. Before I even started the children's program, I was caring for children in my general hospice program. So it's meaningful for them that they can talk to me about their child. So communication, spiritual life, building a team, and recognizing some people are not cut out for it, and that's fine.
Thank you so much,
They're
ma'am.
not cut out for everything, know your strengths.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Ma'am.
Anybody else has any more question? If there is no question, John, I just wanted to know more about the difference of opinion between Cicely Saunders and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross regarding pediatric palliative care.
It was very interesting. When I started doing research for this history, the first thing I found out from Sister Frances Dominica, Anne Goldman, Richard Hayne, who were like the three great leaders in hospice, education, and hospital-based. They all, of course, she was the doyen, she was the hero, went to Sicily, and she said to all of them, don't do it. But she also told people who wanted to open other hospices not to do it. But fortunately, Frances, Richard, and Anne all just ignored what she said and went ahead. And I've spoken to others who knew Cicely Saunders, and Anne Armstrong Daly from Children's Hospice International said she thinks that Cicely had never looked after children and she couldn't bear the thought of them dying. And many years later, I met Cicely Saunders just the once. I went to St. Christopher's in 2002, and she happened to be in her office, and she heard I'd come, and she'd heard I'd had a children's hospice and asked to see me. And all she wanted to know about was the children. But at that particular time, when the field was developing, she was dissuading people from starting children's palliative care. But nobody, not even her great biographer, David Clark, who I asked, or her PA, could explain to me why she did that. But then Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was a different person. She had wanted to be a pediatrician, actually. But because she had two young children and she didn't like the idea of the call-outs with being a pediatrician, she decided to become a psychiatrist. But if you look at her, even her earliest work, she spoke to young people as well as to adults. And so she started with a love of children. She continued a love of children. Cicely never had children. She married, but she never had children. Elizabeth had two children. And she was passionate. She wanted to open a home for AIDS babies, but her neighbors actually got in and burnt it down. So when she was approached, because she was like the Cicely Saunders in the US, she was really too happy. And she sat on the boards of EdMark and Children's Hospice International, and she did everything to promote. So it's where you're coming from that is going to affect the way you are. And I mean, I've got nursing friends who won't deal with children, but they're fabulous in intensive care with adults, with older people. It's knowing where you fit in. But I say it was very interesting seeing those two and to see how palliative care for children really advanced in the US. I even found that in one of the hospitals for a short time they'd had a neonatal unit. And even the hospital couldn't find the records, but I had documentation from newspapers around it as well. So the US really went ahead, but a lot of what spread out, of course, to India and to Africa came via the UK. But we've had incredible people, and nearly all of them in children's palliative care, the pioneers are still alive. Sister Frances, Ida Martinson, the parents who started Ed Mark Children's Hospice, people, Richard Hain, Anne Goldman, you know, some of them are in their 80s, some in their 70s. Richard's younger, he's in his 60s. But these great pioneers, they're virtually all still alive, so you can still talk to them. And you've got fabulous people in India, you know, if I think of Gayatri Palat and Miriam Mukherjee, fabulous world leaders in pediatric palliative care.
Thank you. So I think we can wind up the session for today. So that was a fabulous session, and covering whole aspect of pediatric palliative care, right from the beginning and where we have reached now, and regarding education and many things you talked about. So I hope all of you can go through her slides and download various resources available. Thank you once again, Joan, for finding out this much time for us. And thank you everybody for your active participation. Thank you.
It's been an absolute delight to be with you. So thank you. And I'll see you actually on the 24th when we're looking at humanity, at climate change. Yeah. So thank you all of you. Have a good evening and take care.
Thank you, Joan. Thank you for joining us. And we believe that we all are children when it comes to palliative medicine, learning new things every day.
Absolutely.
So with the positive note that may the system of palliative medicine also grow healthy and successful, just like our children. This is Sri Priya, along with Joan Marston and Dr. Sunil Kumar, signing off from Pallium India's desk. See you in the next session. Till then, everyone, take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye now. Thank you.